Elias Carter had lived in the mountains for so long that the quiet had become part of him. The wind moving through the tall pine trees was the closest thing he had to conversation most days. His cabin sat on a lonely ridge, surrounded by forests that stretched farther than the eye could see. During winter, the world turned completely white, and the only tracks across the snow belonged to animals wandering through the wilderness. Many people believed a man could not live happily in such isolation, but Elias had learned that loneliness sometimes hurt less than memories. Years ago he had lived in a small valley town with his family. His father had been a carpenter who built furniture and repaired wagons for the villagers. His mother kept a small garden behind their house where she grew vegetables and herbs. Life had been simple, peaceful, and full of laughter. Then one winter, everything changed. A sickness swept through the valley faster than anyone could stop it. At first it seemed like nothing more than a bad cold, but within weeks, people began dying. Families stayed locked inside their homes, hoping the illness would pass them by. It didn't. Elias lost his parents first, then his younger sister. Within a month, the town that had once been full of life felt empty and haunted. The grief became unbearable. Every street reminded him of the people who were gone. Every building carried memories that hurt too much to face. So Elias made a decision. He left. He traveled deep into the mountains, where almost no one lived, and built a small log cabin beside a clear mountain stream. At first the wilderness felt harsh and unforgiving. Winters were long, and food was not always easy to find. But Elias was determined to survive. Over time, he learned the rhythms of the forest. He learned where deer traveled during the colder months, where rabbits hid beneath the snow, and which herbs could be gathered during spring. Slowly the mountains became his home. Years passed, and Elias spoke to very few people. Sometimes, traders traveling through the region mentioned a rough winter market that appeared near the frozen river crossing, several miles away. People gathered there every few months to exchange goods and supplies. Elias rarely visited. But, one winter morning, he opened his storage chest and realized he had little choice. His flour sack was completely empty. The last of his lamp oil burned out the previous night, leaving him sitting beside the fire in darkness. Even his salt supply was nearly gone. Those things were impossible to produce alone in the mountains. He needed the market. So Elias packed several animal pelts he had collected over the past weeks, and placed them into a worn leather bag. The pelts were valuable enough to trade for the supplies he needed. Before leaving, he added extra firewood to the fireplace so the cabin would remain warm until he returned. Then he stepped outside into the cold morning air. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the sky above the mountains was pale gray. The journey to the trading camp would take most of the day. Elias followed the narrow trail down the mountain, his boots crunching against frozen snow. Pine trees surrounded him on both sides, their branches heavy with ice. Hours passed as he walked. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sun was already beginning to drop behind the hills. Smoke rising into the sky told him he was close. The winter market appeared exactly where travelers said it would be, near the frozen river crossing where several wagon paths met. Wooden carts stood in messy rows, while fires burned between them to keep people warm. The place was loud and chaotic. Merchants shouted prices across the crowd, while travelers bargained for food and tools. Horses stomped impatiently beside wagons, and the smell of roasted meat drifted through the cold air. To Elias, who had spent months surrounded by silence, the noise felt overwhelming. Still, he pushed through the crowd and quickly found a trader willing to buy his pelts. The man inspected each one carefully before offering flour, salt, and lamp oil in exchange. The trade was fair. Elias packed the supplies into his bag and prepared to leave before nightfall. But just as he turned toward the trail leading back to the mountains, something unusual caught his attention. Near the far edge of the camp stood a rough-looking trader beside a thin figure wrapped in a dark hooded cloak. The figure was clearly a woman. Her head was lowered, and her face was hidden beneath the shadow of the hood. Hanging from the side of the trader's cart was a crooked wooden sign with messy letters scratched into it. The sign read, "Worker, $1." Several men standing nearby laughed when they saw it. One of them said loudly, "Why would anyone pay even $1 for someone who won't talk?" Another man replied, "Maybe she's cursed." The trader didn't seem to care about the insults. He leaned lazily against his cart, while the hooded woman stood perfectly still beside him. Elias felt a strange discomfort watching the scene. Something about the woman's posture caught his attention. She didn't look desperate or frightened, like many of the poor laborers who visited the camp searching for work. Instead, she stood calmly, almost with quiet dignity. Curious, Elias stepped closer. "Why are you selling her?" he asked the trader. The man shrugged. "Found her wandering the mountain road weeks ago. Won't say where she came from. Barely speaks. Useless, if you ask me." He pointed at the sign. "But if someone wants her, they can take her for $1." Elias studied the woman carefully. She remained silent, her face still hidden beneath the hood. Elias reached into his coat pocket. After trading for supplies earlier, he had exactly $1 left. For a moment, he hesitated. He didn't need a worker. His cabin barely had space for another person, and feeding 2 people during winter would be difficult. But something about the situation felt wrong. No person deserved to be treated like property. Without thinking further, Elias pulled the coin from his pocket and placed it into the trader's hand. The man looked surprised for a moment. Then he laughed loudly. "Well, that was easier than I expected," he said as he slipped the coin into his pocket. Before Elias could say anything more, the trader grabbed his coat and disappeared into the busy crowd. Now only Elias and the hooded woman remained beside the cart. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elias turned toward her. "You're free," he said quietly. "You don't belong to anyone now." The woman didn't respond. She didn't even lift her head. Elias sighed softly and adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "Well," he muttered, "that's settled." Then he turned and began walking toward the mountain trail. Snow had already begun falling again, and darkness would arrive soon. After a few steps, he heard something behind him. Soft footsteps. He stopped and turned around. The hooded woman was following him. Elias frowned slightly. "You don't have to come with me," he said. "There are towns not far from here." The woman said nothing. She simply continued standing there silently. Elias looked toward the dark mountain trail ahead of him. Then he looked back at the quiet figure behind him. Finally he sighed. "Suit yourself," he said. And together, the lonely mountain man and the mysterious hooded woman began the long journey into the snowy mountains. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single dollar had just changed both of their lives forever. The mountain trail, leading away from the trading camp, quickly swallowed the noise of the market behind them. Within minutes, the shouting merchants, laughing gamblers, and clattering wagons faded into the distance, until only the sound of wind through the trees remained. Elias walked ahead on the narrow path, while the hooded woman followed several steps behind him. The sky above the mountains had turned a deep gray, and snowflakes slowly drifted down from the clouds. Winter nights came quickly in the highlands, and Elias knew they needed to move steadily if they were going to reach his cabin before the cold became dangerous. Still, something about the situation felt strange. He had lived alone for so many years that walking beside another person felt unfamiliar. Even though she remained several steps behind him, he could sense her presence with every movement. The crunch of her boots against the snow echoed quietly in the forest. For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke. Elias occasionally glanced over his shoulder to make sure she was still following. Each time he looked back, the woman walked calmly with steady steps, her cloak moving gently with the wind. She never complained about the cold. She never asked where they were going. She simply followed. The forest grew darker as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Soon the only light came from the pale glow of the moon rising above the snow-covered peaks. Elias slowed his pace and finally stopped beside a fallen tree. "We should rest for a moment," he said. The woman stopped several feet away, but said nothing. Elias knelt down and gathered dry branches from beneath the snow. Within a few minutes, he had built a small fire that crackled softly against the quiet forest. Orange flames flickered across the snow, sending warmth into the cold air. The woman stepped closer to the fire and held her hands near the flames. Even now, she kept her face hidden beneath the hood. Elias opened his bag and pulled out a small piece of dried venison. "You should eat," he said, offering it to her. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she slowly accepted the food. "Thank you," she said softly. Elias froze. It was the first time he had heard her voice. It was gentle, calm, and surprisingly steady. "You can speak," Elias said, raising an eyebrow. The woman lowered her head slightly. "Yes," she answered. Elias leaned back against the fallen tree and studied her carefully. "Then why didn't you say anything at the market?" he asked. For several seconds, she remained silent again. Finally she spoke, "Because speaking often brings more trouble than silence." Her words were simple, but carried a quiet sadness. Elias considered them carefully. "I suppose that depends on who you're speaking to," he replied. The woman slowly lowered her hood, just enough for the firelight to touch her face. Elias could now see her clearly for the first time. She looked young, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her eyes reflected the flickering firelight with a strange mixture of strength and exhaustion. Despite the worn cloak she wore, there was something refined about her posture and the way she carried herself. She didn't look like someone who belonged among rough traders and gamblers. "My name is Clara," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "I'm Elias." For a moment, the two strangers simply sat beside the fire under the cold mountain sky. The wind moved through the pine trees above them, while snow continued falling softly around the clearing. Clara stared into the flames, as if lost in thought. After a while, Elias asked, "Where were you planning to go if you hadn't followed me?" Clara shook her head slowly. "I'm not sure." Her voice carried a hint of honesty that surprised him. "For weeks I have been moving from place to place," she continued. "Each time I thought I found somewhere safe, something happened that forced me to leave again." Elias frowned slightly. "What kind of trouble?" he asked. Clara hesitated before answering. "Men who ask too many questions. Others who assume things about a woman traveling alone." Her words were careful, but Elias understood the meaning behind them. Life in rough frontier camps could be dangerous for someone without protection. He stared into the fire for a moment. "Following a stranger into the mountains is still a risky choice," he said. Clara gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You didn't buy me to control me," she replied. "You told me I was free." She paused before adding quietly, "That told me enough about the kind of man you are." Elias felt slightly uncomfortable hearing that. He wasn't used to compliments. "I only gave that trader $1 because the situation felt wrong," he said. "Maybe," Clara replied softly, "but most people walked past and ignored it." The fire crackled between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elias stood and kicked snow over the dying flames. "We should keep moving," he said. "My cabin is still several miles away." Clara nodded and pulled her hood back over her head. They continued walking through the dark forest. The trail climbed higher into the mountains, winding between rocky slopes and frozen streams. The air grew colder with every step. But the silence between them felt different now. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It felt calmer, almost peaceful. As they walked, Clara finally asked a question. Have you lived in these mountains long? Elias nodded without turning around. Almost 10 years. Alone? She asked. Yes. Clara seemed surprised by that. Doesn't it get lonely? She asked. Elias thought about the question carefully before answering. At first it did, he said. But, after a while, the quiet becomes easier than the noise of the world. Clara looked up toward the dark mountain peaks surrounding them. I think I understand that, she said. Hours passed as they continued climbing through the snow-covered forest. Eventually Elias stopped and pointed toward a faint glow in the distance. There, he said. Clara followed his gaze. A small light flickered through the trees. That's my cabin. Relief crossed her face. As they approached the small wooden structure, the mountains around them felt even quieter than before. Smoke still rose faintly from the chimney, where Elias had left embers burning earlier that morning. He pushed the wooden door open and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but warm. A small fireplace sat against one wall, and shelves filled with jars and tools lined the room. Clara stepped inside slowly, looking around with curiosity. Elias added fresh wood to the fire, and flames quickly filled the room with warmth. For the first time since leaving the market, Clara removed her cloak completely. She looked around the cabin again before speaking. This place feels peaceful, she said quietly. Elias nodded. That's why I stayed. Outside, the wind began rising again, carrying fresh snow through the mountains. Inside the small cabin, however, the fire crackled warmly. Two strangers sat across from each other in silence. Neither of them realized it yet. But the journey they had just begun would soon change both of their lives forever. The fire burned steadily inside the small cabin, filling the room with warmth, while the wind outside grew stronger. Snow began falling again, tapping softly against the wooden walls and the small window near the fireplace. The mountains had a way of trapping storms, and Elias could already tell this one would last through the night. Clara sat quietly on the wooden chair beside the table, warming her hands near the fire. Without the hood covering her face, Elias could finally see her clearly. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders in loose strands, and although her clothes were worn from travel, there was something about her appearance that suggested she had once lived a very different life. Elias moved around the cabin, placing the supplies he had bought at the trading camp onto the shelves. Flour, salt, and oil were precious during winter, and he carefully organized them the way he always did. After a few minutes he placed a small pot over the fire and poured water into it. "Soup?" he asked. Clara nodded gently. "Yes, thank you." Elias added dried vegetables and a little meat to the pot. The smell slowly filled the cabin as the water began to boil. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt calm rather than uncomfortable. Elias had grown used to long stretches without conversation, but now he found himself strangely aware that someone else shared the room with him. Clara studied the cabin carefully. Every corner reflected the life of someone who had learned to survive alone. There were hunting tools hanging on the walls, bundles of dried herbs tied above the fireplace, and carefully stacked firewood near the door. Despite its simplicity, the cabin felt safe. After months of uncertainty and fear, Clara felt her body slowly relax for the first time. Elias handed her a bowl of soup once it was ready. She accepted it gratefully and took a small sip. "It's good," she said. Elias gave a quiet nod and sat down across from her. For a moment, he simply watched the flames dancing in the fireplace. Then Clara spoke again. "You asked earlier why speaking caused trouble for me." Elias looked up. "Yes." She stared down into the bowl for a moment before continuing. "I suppose I should explain." Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of many difficult memories. "My family is from a city far south of these mountains," she said slowly. "My father was a merchant, a very successful one." Elias listened quietly. Clara continued. We traded textiles, spices, and precious metals between several major towns. Our caravans traveled long distances through many regions. She paused briefly. When you grow up in a wealthy family, people see you differently. Elias nodded slightly. He had never been wealthy, but he understood how power could attract attention. Clara continued her story. 6 months ago, my father arranged for me to travel with one of our caravans. I wanted to learn more about the business and the trade routes. Her expression darkened slightly. That journey was supposed to be simple. Elias leaned forward slightly, sensing something serious coming. But halfway through the mountains, we were attacked. The wind outside howled louder, as if echoing the memory. Bandits? Elias asked. Clara nodded. Yes. Her voice became quieter. They struck during the night, while most of us were asleep. Wagons were burned, horses ran in every direction, people were shouting and trying to escape. She looked into the fire again, remembering the chaos. I ran into the forest when the fighting began. I didn't know where anyone else had gone. Did you find your family? Elias asked. Clara shook her head slowly. No. The single word carried deep sadness. I wandered through the mountains for days, trying to find a road or another caravan. Eventually I reached a small camp. Elias could already guess what came next. They didn't help you, he said. Clara gave a faint smile. Some tried, others saw opportunity. Her eyes hardened slightly. When people learn that a woman traveling alone once belonged to a wealthy family, they start thinking about rewards. Elias understood. Kidnapping, he said quietly. Clara nodded. Exactly. She explained how several groups of rough traders had tried to take control of her journey over the past months. Some hoped to demand ransom money from her father. Others simply wanted to profit from selling her labor. That's why I stopped telling people who I was, she said. Silence was safer. Elias leaned back in his chair. It made sense now. You pretended to be someone with no story, he said. Yes. Clara sighed softly. But eventually that trader you met decided he was tired of dealing with me. She smiled faintly. So he tried to sell me for $1. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. I suppose that explains why everyone thought you were strange. Clara gave a small laugh. I suppose it does. The wind outside rattled the cabin door again. Snow continued piling against the walls. Elias stood and added more wood to the fire. When he returned to his chair, he studied Clara carefully. You're still in danger, he said. Clara looked at him. Yes. People could still be searching for you. That's possible. Elias stared toward the window where darkness covered the mountains. The wilderness had always protected him from the problems of the outside world. Now those problems had followed him home. Clara seemed to sense what he was thinking. If my presence causes trouble for you, she said quietly, I can leave once the storm passes. Elias looked at her for several seconds. Then he shook his head. The storm outside isn't the kind you walk into alone, he said. You'll stay here until it passes. Clara seemed relieved. Thank you. For the next few hours they talked more about their pasts. Elias told her about the sickness that had taken his family, and the reason he chose to live in the mountains. Clara listened carefully. In many ways, their lives had followed different paths, but carried the same loneliness. Late that night, the storm outside grew even stronger. Snow slammed against the cabin walls, while the wind roared through the trees. Inside the cabin, however, the fire burned warmly. Eventually, Clara fell asleep in the chair beside the fireplace. Elias covered her with a spare blanket before sitting quietly at the table. For years he had believed his life would remain the same forever. Quiet, predictable, alone. But tonight the mountains felt different. Somehow a single decision, a single dollar, had brought a stranger into his world. And deep inside, Elias felt the strange sense that their story had only just begun. The storm that had begun during the night did not fade by morning. Instead, it grew stronger. When Elias opened the cabin door just after sunrise, a wall of freezing wind rushed inside, forcing him to step back immediately. Snow had piled high against the entrance, nearly reaching the wooden handle. The forest outside had completely disappeared behind a curtain of white. The wind roared through the mountains like an angry river. Elias closed the door again and secured the latch. "Well," he said calmly, brushing snow from his coat, "looks like we're not going anywhere for a while." Clara stood beside the fireplace, watching him. "Is it that bad?" she asked. Elias nodded. "These mountain storms can last several days, sometimes longer." He walked toward the window and wiped the frost from the glass. Outside, snow spun wildly through the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet. "If anyone tried traveling through this," he added, "they'd probably lose their way before reaching the valley." Clara sat down slowly on the chair near the table. For the first time since arriving, she seemed truly calm. In truth, she had been running for months, from one road to another, from one camp to the next. Every place had felt temporary and unsafe. But this small cabin, hidden high in the mountains, felt different. Safe. Elias placed a kettle over the fire and poured water inside. "Tea?" he asked. Clara smiled softly. "I would like that." The hours passed quietly. Outside, the storm raged louder, shaking the walls of the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled gently, filling the room with warmth and the comforting smell of burning pine. Clara soon found ways to help. She swept snow that had blown inside earlier, organized several jars on the shelves, and helped Elias prepare a simple meal of bread and soup. At first the work felt awkward. Both of them were used to living their lives alone. But slowly they found a rhythm. By the afternoon, the cabin felt less like a stranger's shelter and more like a shared space. While Elias repaired a broken handle on one of his tools, Clara examined a bundle of dried herbs hanging near the fireplace. "You gathered these yourself?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Most of them grow along the riverbanks in spring." Clara picked one gently and smelled it. "It reminds me of the gardens my mother kept," she said quietly. Elias looked up. "You miss them?" Clara's eyes lowered slightly. "Yes." There was a brief silence before she continued. "I often wonder if any of them survived the attack." Elias understood that feeling well, the pain of not knowing. "It's possible," he said carefully. "Caravans scatter during attacks. Some people escape without realizing it." Clara looked toward the fire. "I hope so." The storm outside continued into the evening. By nightfall, the wind had grown even stronger. The sound of it rushing through the trees was loud enough to shake the cabin walls. Elias added more wood to the fire before sitting down across from Clara. They shared another simple meal. Afterward, they talked longer than either of them expected. Clara told stories about the city she had visited during her travels with the caravans. Busy markets, filled with colorful fabrics, musicians playing in crowded streets, and ships arriving at harbor ports carrying goods from distant lands. Elias listened with curiosity. He had never traveled far beyond the mountains. "Sounds like a loud place," he said. Clara laughed softly. "It is." "Too loud for me," Elias replied. Clara studied him for a moment. "You truly prefer this life?" she asked. Elias looked around the cabin. The wooden walls, the warm fire, the quiet mountains beyond the window. "Yes," he said simply. "But sometimes," he added slowly, "even quiet places can feel too quiet." Clara understood what he meant. Loneliness had a way of finding people no matter where they lived. The next day, the storm continued. Snow covered nearly everything outside the cabin. Elias attempted to clear the door in the morning, but quickly realized the snow was still falling too heavily. travel was impossible. So the two of them remained inside again. The second day passed more easily than the first. Clara helped cook breakfast, while Elias chopped firewood just outside the door whenever the wind slowed enough to allow it. Later they sat beside the fireplace, talking about their childhoods. Elias described the valley town where he once lived, the small wooden houses, the festivals during spring, and the sound of children running through the streets. Clara listened carefully. "Do you ever think about returning?" she asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "That place belongs to a different life now." Clara understood. Some memories were easier to carry from a distance. That evening, as the sun set behind thick storm clouds, Clara stood near the window, looking out at the endless white mountains. Elias noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Turned toward him. "Something strange," she said. "What?" She smiled slightly. "For months I have been searching for a place where I felt safe." She paused. "And somehow I found it by accident." Elias didn't respond right away, but deep down he felt something shift inside him. For years his cabin had been nothing more than a shelter from the world. Now it felt like something else, something warmer, something shared. The storm outside continued through the night, but inside the cabin, two lives that had once been lonely were slowly beginning to change. Neither Elias nor Clara realized yet just how important those quiet days together would become. Because when the storm finally ended, the world outside would bring new challenges, and a decision that could change both of their futures forever. The storm finally began to ease, leaving the mountains covered in a thick, sparkling blanket of snow. Sunlight reflected off the icy peaks, turning the forest into a dazzling white landscape. The silence outside the cabin was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of a frozen branch or the soft murmur of a distant stream. Elias stepped outside, surveying the world that had been transformed overnight. The trail leading down the mountain was almost invisible beneath the snow, but he could see where the storm had swept away old leaves and revealed frozen rocks beneath. He knew traveling now would be tricky, but the storm's end brought a sense of relief. Clara followed him outside, her hood down, letting the pale sunlight touch her face for the first time in weeks. She breathed deeply, the cold air filling her lungs and clearing the heaviness that had built up over months of fear and running. Elias noticed how she moved with confidence now, not the cautious steps of someone used to hiding from danger. She was alert, aware, and yet somehow at peace. But that peace was fragile. Elias had learned during his time in the mountains that danger often came quietly. Even a hidden threat could destroy everything he had built. As they prepared to secure the cabin for the day, he noticed movement at the edge of the tree line. Shadows shifted unnaturally among the trees, and he caught the glint of metal, the reflection of a blade, perhaps, in the morning sun. His instincts, honed over years of solitary survival, told him that someone was approaching. "Clara," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder, "stay behind me." She obeyed without hesitation. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held a fierce determination. She had endured fear for months, but she was no longer powerless. The shadows emerged from the forest. Two men, rugged and well-armed, stepped onto the snow-covered clearing. Their clothing was worn, their expressions hard, and their eyes were fixed firmly on Clara. One of them stepped forward. "We've been looking for you." Clara froze for a moment, fear flashing across her face, but then she straightened, as if remembering that she was no longer alone. Elias moved instinctively, stepping in front of her. His hand rested on the handle of his hunting knife, ready to defend her. "I don't think she's going anywhere with you," Elias said calmly, his voice firm and unyielding. He had faced wild animals, harsh winters and isolation, but he had never encountered people with cruel intentions quite like this. Yet his resolve didn't waver. The first man sneered. "You don't understand. She belongs to people who know her family. She's valuable. Elias's gaze sharpened. "She belongs to no one," he said, "and if you try to take her from here, you'll regret it." For a tense moment, neither side moved. Snow drifted around their boots, and the cold mountain air seemed to amplify the silence. Then, the second man lunged toward Clara. Elias was faster. Years of living alone in the mountains had trained his body for sudden, precise action. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to drop his weapon. Clara instinctively pulled a small branch from the ground, holding it defensively as the first man charged. The fight was brief but intense. Elias's survival skills and raw strength, combined with Clara's quick thinking, gave them the upper hand. Within moments, both intruders were retreating, struggling to maintain balance on the slick, icy ground, and finally fleeing into the forest without another word. Elias dropped to his knees, breathing heavily from exertion, while Clara stood close by, her eyes wide with relief and admiration. "You," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved me." Elias shook his head. "No one should have to face that alone," he said. "Not you." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then, in the quiet aftermath of danger, she spoke something she hadn't spoken in weeks. Something real, unfiltered, and from the heart. "Elias, thank you for everything." Her voice was clear, warm, and gentle. Elias felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He realized that this simple act, buying her for $1, protecting her, sharing fire and shelter, had grown into something far deeper than mere friendship or obligation. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "It was the right thing to do." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with emotion. "No one has ever treated me like that before. Like I mattered. Not because of who my family was, or what I could bring them, but just because I'm me." Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own loneliness lift slightly. For the first time in years, he realized that his life didn't have to be spent in isolation. He stepped closer to her, their eyes meeting. The snow sparkled around them like tiny stars, and the cold wind seemed to pause for a moment, as if giving them space to understand the magnitude of what was happening. "You're safe here," he said, "and you'll stay safe as long as I'm here." Clara reached out and touched his hand lightly. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything she had felt over the past weeks. The fear, the relief, the trust, and the budding connection between them. I think I want to stay," she whispered. Elias nodded, a smile forming on his face for the first time in years. It was not a wide grin, but a quiet, deep smile that reached his eyes. The realization struck him fully at that moment. She was the one he had been waiting for. Not just a companion for survival, but someone whose presence could fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. She had arrived silently, following him into the mountains, and in doing so, had reshaped his world entirely. Over the next hours, they worked together to secure the cabin against any future threats. Clara learned quickly how to handle the fire, prepare food, and manage supplies, while Elias showed her how to identify tracks in the snow and recognize danger approaching through the trees. The lessons were practical, but they also deepened their bond. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Elias and Clara sat together near the fireplace. The storm was gone, leaving the mountains serene and calm. The danger had passed, but the experience had revealed something undeniable, a connection forged through adversity and trust. Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself. "I never believed I would find a place where I truly belonged." Elias looked at her, his eyes softening. "You found it," he said. She turned to him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "And I found someone I can trust," she added. The words hung in the warm cabin air. For Elias, it was the confirmation of everything he had begun to feel, the recognition that his life had changed irrevocably. The solitary existence he had accepted for so long was no longer necessary, and he realized that the one he had quietly protected, fed, and guided through the storm was more than just a companion. She was the person he could share his life with, someone who understood his silence and shared his resilience. He reached out and held her hand gently, and in that simple touch, both understood the depth of what had grown between them. The hooded woman who had once walked silently into his life now spoke openly and honestly, and in doing so had become his equal, his partner, and the one he had unknowingly been waiting for. The mountains around them glimmered in the moonlight, and for the first time in years, Elias felt complete. Not just because he had survived the storm or defended against danger, but because in Clara he had found a heart that matched his own. A companion who had endured the same trials, who had faced fear, and who had chosen to walk beside him when she could have gone anywhere else. He knew then, without doubt, that the decision to spend that single dollar had changed his destiny. The mountains that had once seemed endless and isolating now felt alive with hope, warmth, and the promise of a shared future. As the night settled over the peaks, Elias and Clara sat together near the fire, sharing stories, laughter, and quiet moments of understanding. Outside, the snow glistened, and the world remained silent. Inside, two hearts had found their home in one another. And so, the poor mountain man who had paid just $1 for a hooded woman realized, as she spoke her first words of trust and gratitude, that she was the one he had been waiting for all along.